The title of this series, as you can see up there, is There Will Be a King. That comes from 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 19, which says, "But the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, 'No, but there shall be a king over us.'" They didn't necessarily know how right they had it, because God did give them a king, and he gave them their first king, King Saul, a man after their own hearts. So they may be a nation like all the other nations. But as we've been seeing over the past few weeks, not only has he given them a man after their own hearts, but we also see that now he is in the process of giving them a man after his own heart. Eventually, he would once again be their king. There will be a king. Only this time the king would not be some human being, but would once again be God. But not dwelling in tabernacles or even temples, but in the flesh. And that would be later on, from 1 Samuel, that is, Samuel's perspective, David's perspective, the people's perspective. In the past for us, and ultimately still to be future as we see it inaugurated. But it would seem that at this point in time that God, in order to get David on the throne, is having to save David from everybody. We saw that he saved David from the hand of Goliath. We see that multiple times he is saving David from the hand of Saul. We saw that he had to save David from the hand of the Philistines, from the king of Gath, even had to save David from starvation through the work of Ahimelech, giving him the showbread. But as we get into 1 Samuel chapter 25, what we are seeing ultimately today is that God even has to save David from himself. God has to save David from David. Because David's about to make a huge mistake. God had to save David from himself. So as we open up 1 Samuel chapter 25, we're going to see three movements of this story, three movements of this narrative. In the first movement, what we're going to see is really the incidents that led to God stepping in to save David from himself. In the second movement, we're going to see the instrument that God used in order to save David from himself. And then finally, in the third movement, we're going to see the impact that God had on David when he stepped in to save David from himself. So those are the three right there: the incidents, the instrument, and then ultimately the impact that God has on David. So again, if you have your Pew Bible, that's page 231. If you will, though, please stand for the honor of the reading of God's Word. I'm not sure that's actually going to be up there this morning, because I forgot to put that part of the Scriptures in there. But we're going to read from verse 1 until verse 8. Now Samuel died, and all Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him in his house at Ramah. Then David rose and went down to the wilderness of Paran. And there was a man of Maon whose business was in Carmel. The man was very rich. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. He was shearing his sheep in Carmel. Now the name of the man was Nabal, and the name of his wife Abigail. The woman was discerning and beautiful, but the man was harsh and badly behaved. He was a Calebite. David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep. So David sent 10 young men. And David said to the young men, "Go up to Carmel and go to Nabal and greet him in my name. And thus you shall greet him. Peace be to you, and peace be to your house, and peace be to all that you have. I hear that you have shearers. Now your shepherds have been with us, and we did them no harm. And they missed nothing all the time they were in Carmel. Ask your young men, and they will tell you. Therefore, let my young men find favor in your eyes, for we come on a feast day. Please give whatever you have at hand to your servants and to your son David." Thank you. You may be seated. So as we open up 1 Samuel 25, we see first again of those three movements in this story that we're going to deal with the incidents that lead up to God stepping in to save David from himself. And the very first incident that we see that's happening is Samuel's death. Now Samuel died, verse 1. Now Samuel died, and all Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him in his house at Ramah. And then David rose and went down to the wilderness at Paran. Samuel had been the last judge of Israel before they had a king. He was also the very first named prophet that Israel had since Moses. First named prophet since Moses. And so Samuel was the very one who went to Saul and ordained him, anointed him as king. And he is the very one who went to David and anointed him as king. And so there is, of course, going to be some type of affection between Saul and Samuel. And there's going to be an affection between David and Samuel. He meant something to everybody. Everybody was there. Everybody was mourning. Probably Saul was there as well, even though he's not mentioned. But David was certainly there. The writer wants us to take note that David was at that funeral because, in essence, David was profoundly affected by Saul's passing. So much so that he left the cover of the strongholds that we saw him in the previous chapter to go to Ramah to mourn with the rest of Israel. It's only after Samuel is buried that David goes back into the wilderness. So he was profoundly affected by Samuel's passing, mourning over it. And sadness and mourning can cause people to do and to say things that they would not normally do and not normally say. So we see that first incident is that David is mourning over Samuel's death, but there's a second incident that's going on too. The writer tells us about Nabal and Nabal's denial. That's the second thing that's going on here, Nabal's denial. So Samuel's death, Nabal's denial. And that denial takes up quite a bit of space, but let's look real quick at 2 and 3 here. And there was a man in Maon whose business was in Carmel. The man was very rich. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. He was shearing his sheep in Carmel. Now the name of the man was Nabal, and the name of his wife Abigail. The woman was discerning and beautiful, but the man was harsh and badly behaved. He was a Calebite. It's almost like, it seems like the ESV, the writers of the ESV, or the translators of the ESV, is almost like, yeah, he was a Calebite. That's why he was, don't get that impression, okay? It was just simply that he was a Calebite. He was actually a fellow Judahite. So we have, here's David, right? We have this character, David, whom we know about. He was ruddy, he was handsome, right? He was very cunning. And then we have Nabal, a fellow Judahite. Bethlehem's in Judah. Caleb's territory was in Judah, so they're kind of like family here. In fact, Caleb and his descendants actually founded Bethlehem. So there's some type of kinship here, right? So there's Nabal, who's there, not at all like David. Nabal's harsh, he's mean-spirited. And he's a Calebite, like I said. But then we have Abigail. And Abigail is much closer to David than Nabal. Abigail's beautiful. David's handsome. Abigail's beautiful. David's cunning. Abigail's a woman of understanding. So there's our characters here. Now, Nabal, being harsh and having bad behavior, received a report that we read from David's men that they had looked after the shepherds and the sheep, right? So again, you go back to verse 2, and you'll see there were 3,000 sheep, which would have taken quite a bit of shepherding. 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. These were under shepherds' care, but then those shepherds and the sheep, his flock, came under the care of David's men. And so David sends word to Nabal. It's time to shear the sheep. It's time to have a festival. Right? And so David sends word by his own men to Nabal, hey, we took care of your guys. And some would say maybe that it was presumptuous of David to expect that Nabal would somehow give recompense to him. I mean, it wasn't like Nabal hired him or anything. It wasn't like they had a contract that Nabal went to David and said, hey, if you'll watch my sheep, I'll give you some of the goodies from it. I don't know necessarily that it would be too presumptuous. Think about it for a second. There's not a contract, right, between a server and a patron of a restaurant. When someone walks into a restaurant and the server is there to give service, there's no contract that says, hey, I'm going to give you good service and you're going to give me a good tip, right? But you would expect that in a restaurant, that if there is a server who does give a good tip or who does give good service, it is right for them to expect to get a good tip. Or a housekeeper who's at a hotel, right? And you would expect that if that housekeeper provides good service for the tenant of that hotel, right, and cleans their room nice and gives them fresh towels and linens and such, right, that they should, at the end of that time or even daily, should receive at least some type of reward, some type of tip. There's no contract going on there, but you would think that from the service that would then somebody would want to show their gratitude for the service. So David, not necessarily too presumptuous here, to think that if he showed service to Nabal, that Nabal would want to show his gratitude. But Nabal doesn't have gratitude. He doesn't desire to show it. They go to him. The men go to him. They don't actually ask for anything. They don't actually say, hey, this is what we require of you. They don't even ask for even some type of amount. They just say, hey, this is what we have. If you're wanting to show gratitude, show some gratitude. We'll accept it. We won't deny it. They just let their services be known and allowed Nabal to make up his own mind, and he certainly made up his mind. Look at verse 10 here. And Nabal answered David's servants, who is David? Who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants these days who are breaking away from their master. Shall I take my bread and my water and my meat that I have killed for my shearers and give it to men who come from I don't know where? There are various ways to understand this text. First, he may not have understood who David was. He just never heard of David. That's probably not likely, but it's possible, right? It's kind of like during the Civil War, somebody not knowing who General Grant was, or during World War II, never hearing of General Eisenhower, or even in the 90s, General Schwarzkopf, right? It's like, who wouldn't have heard of these people? You had to have been buried under a rock not to have heard of these people. So probably not that Nabal had never heard of David. David was the number one commander of Saul's army. So it could have been that instead of that, maybe Nabal didn't really trust David's servants, right? So he's like, hey, there are a lot of servants that have separated from their master. How do I know that you're actually still with David? David's not here. He's not here to back up your word. How do I know that if I give you food and water and meat and such that you're just not going to take it and run off with it? I don't know who you are. I don't know you guys from Adam. So that's possible. It works with the text. But probably, it's more likely that David was being lumped in with these servants. That he knew who David was, and the way he saw things was that David and these men had separated themselves from King Saul and had rebelled against King Saul. And Nabal would have no part in feeding them. So the team goes back to David. Gives him the bad news. Nabal said no. So then, again, we have the incident of Samuel's death, and now we have Nabal's denial. But it leads to David's displeasure. So let's go. Verse 13. And David said to his men, every man strap on his sword. And every man of them strapped on his sword. David also strapped on his sword, and about 400 of the men went up after David, while 200 remained with the baggage. So in his anger, and his displeasure, and his sadness, David is going to go up and do something that would be utterly out of character for him. He's planning on killing not just Nabal, but he's going to kill every man that is in the household of Nabal. And understand that's just not the family, but that is everyone in his household, servants as well. And how is it that David could do such a thing? It's just not in his character. It doesn't seem like everything that we've seen so far. So far, we've almost had like this perfect picture of Christ, right? That he's a type of Christ. So how is it then that we could look at him and go that this is a type of Christ when he is about to do something this despicable? Well, the thing about it is David was still human, right? He's not incapable of doing something this despicable. None of us are. That's the thing with sin. It's in us. It's in our very souls to sin. It's part of us. Lust can absolutely lead to adultery. Anger can lead to murder, as it does here with David. Let's go real quick to James chapter 1. Look at verses 14 and 15 here. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. It's in us. Such a small seed of anger can lead to such a big sin as murder if it's allowed to grow and give birth. And it comes in various ways, right? I mean, it could just come in abusive words. It could come in abusive actions, self-harm here. With David, it's about to turn into murder. The sin of murder lie dormant in the seed of anger that was already in David. And when David received word from his servants of Nabal's denial, that murder woke up. So far we've seen Samuel's death, Nabal's denial, David's displeasure. The last incident that we see here is a servant's disclosure. Look at verse 14. But when one of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife, one of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife, behold, David sent messengers out to the wilderness to greet our master, and he railed at them. So there we go. God's working something through. God's having to step in. And these are the incidents that lead God to bring in his instrument of peace. So the report of the servant leads to that second movement of the narrative in which Abigail is being used by the Lord, right? In other words, Abigail is God's servant or is God's instrument in saving David from himself. What I find curious is that Abigail is more concerned about saving David than she is about her husband, saving her husband. And she's concerned about both, but she seems much more concerned about David's future than she is about her husband's future. But she's trying to do both, right? So Abigail did what her husband had denied, right? So the first thing that she does is that Abigail, first way that God uses her as an instrument is that he sends food. She sent food to David. She put together a whole bunch of food. She put together a party worth of food so that she could send it to with her servants to the men ahead of her. But she knew that gesture isn't going to be good enough, so it's not just simply that she had to send food, but then she had to go and speak herself to David, which goes outside of the social norms. Women, who had husbands, obviously, and just women in general, typically didn't speak to other men in public. Certainly not if they had a husband. And they certainly did not aid and abet the husband's enemy. That's what she's doing. She's sending food ahead, and she's going to talk with him herself. She's doing both of these things. Why? Because she was beautiful, but she was smart. She understood what was going on. She had an understanding of what was going on, even if her husband was foolishly blind to it. So she went to meet David, who was still fuming over Nabal's denial. He was working himself into a lather. Look at me real quick. Verse 21, 22. Now David said, "Surely in vain have I guarded all that this fellow has in the wilderness, so nothing was missed of all that belonged to him. And he has returned me evil for good. God do so to the enemies of David and more also, if by morning I leave not so much as one male of all who belong to him." Who's he talking to? Nobody. He's talking to himself. He's working himself into a lather. Anybody ever do that? I do. Where you recount what the injustice that has just happened to you, whatever it is that just happened to you, and you recount that, and you work yourself up, and you get angry, and you're just like, you're playing it off in your mind, how things are going to go. Right? I do that all the time. How dare they? How dare they do blah, blah, blah. Oh, just wait. Just wait till I, right? Ever do it? I do it. We work ourselves up. When we get into such a state, we can rest assured that Satan's work is done. He just sits back and watches. He doesn't have to do anything else. Unless God steps in somehow, we've pretty much gone so far that there's no stepping back. We become Satan's instruments instead of God's. But Abigail, even though she could have berated Nabal, instead, she mediated for him. She was God's instrument. So we see the first way that she was an instrument of God was that she sent food, but the second way that we see is that she is seeking forgiveness. Look at verse 23 and 24. When Abigail saw David, she hurried and got down from the donkey and fell before David on her face and bowed to the ground. And she fell at his feet. "On me alone, my lord, be the guilt. Please let your servant speak in your ears and hear the words of your servant." And that's not to say, so as we're looking at this, right, it's not to say that Abigail wasn't honest. She was absolutely honest. She told it like it was. She spoke honestly about her husband. Let's look at verse 25. She understands what's going on. "Let not my lord regard this worthless fellow Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him." Nabal means folly. It means foolishness, right? So basically, every time I read those words, I think in my head, Nabal's his name, folly's his game. That's what she's saying. If Abigail had been around, these things would never have happened. David would have gone away, or his men would have gone away with food, but Abigail was doing something else. She didn't know. She didn't realize what a jerk her husband had been. But look at her argument. Look how she saw herself. Look at verse 26. "Now then, my Lord, as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, because the Lord has restrained you from blood guilt and from saving with your own hand, now then let your enemies and those who seek to do evil to my Lord be as Nabal." She saw herself as God's instrument. The Lord had restrained David from blood guilt. In other words, murder. Murder was a capital offense. Now we know that under monarchies, right, the monarch, the king, the queen, whatever, they can get away sometimes with things that other people can't get away with, that citizens or subjects can't get away with. David was not yet king. David was still a subject. And therefore, it really would have been blood guilt. He would have received the death penalty. It was a capital offense. He really, even if he was a king, he should have received it as well. But here is Abigail, and she is speaking prophetically to David. And therefore, David was reminded of God's promises. Verse 28, please forgive the trespass of your servant, for the Lord will certainly make my Lord a sure house, because my Lord is fighting the battles of the Lord, and evil shall not be found in you so long as you live. You understand that the word servant there that we see in the ESV, I think it's also in the CSB, the word servant is in the feminine. We're not talking about Nabal. She's not asking for forgiveness on behalf of Nabal. She's asking forgiveness on her behalf. Maidservant, it's how the NASB translates it. And I think they translate it probably pretty well because it doesn't cause confusion there. She's talking about herself, so she asked forgiveness for herself. She saw Nabal's sin as her own mistake and that she wasn't there to stop it. Now, theologically, she was wrong. Each sin is upon that person. But pragmatically, she was right. It was a smart move on Abigail's part. She took the focus off of Nabal and his idiocy and put it on herself. Now take note how many times in these few verses of Abigail speaking to David, how many times she says, my Lord. She says it quite a bit. Lowercase L-O-R-D. Obviously, if it's all caps, that's the equivalent Adonai to Yahweh. But in the lowercase here, it's not the word Adonai, meaning Yahweh. It actually just means sir. It means man. It can even mean husband. And the writer, Abigail even, is being punny here, playing on words. We're going to see that in a few minutes. But notice how many times she keeps calling David my Lord, which can also be translated my husband. It's a pun, because as we see at the very end of the chapter, David ends up marrying Abigail. But there's more to it than that. So Abigail moves from seeking forgiveness. That's the second thing that she does, right? Second way that she's an instrument, to ultimately that she is stressing faithfulness. She is stressing both God's faithfulness and David's faithfulness all at the same time. Right? So in that promise, in that prophecy that she's making, she says, God is going to give you that throne. He's going to establish your house. Therefore, God is faithful. And then she says, because you are fighting the Lord's battles, because you're being faithful. There's faithfulness on both sides here. Incidentally, though, the point that I think that she was trying to make is, David, this isn't God's battle. This is your battle. Nabal came against you. He denied you what you thought was rightfully yours, and you're going against him. Therefore, you're not being faithful to the Lord at this moment. Reverse course. David's pride had gotten the best of him. He wanted to avenge himself. And so Abigail reminded him of God's work in his life and of his work as God's man. And then we read those words, says, and evil shall not be found in you so long as you live. And I don't think that's probably the best way to put it. I think that the CSB puts it a little bit better, because it sounds like, hey, you're never going to do evil ever. And we know David did evil. CSB puts it throughout your life. May evil not be found in you. And so we see Abigail reminding David of God's promises, that he would establish his house, that David would fight for God, and finally the throne would be David's. Look at verse 30 through 31. And when the Lord has done to my Lord according to all the good that he has spoken concerning you, and has appointed you prince or leader over Israel, my Lord shall have no cause for grief or pangs of conscience. for having shed blood without cause, or for my Lord working salvation himself. And when the Lord has dealt well with my Lord, then remember your servant or your maidservant. Now, how important would that be? For David to ascend to the throne, guilt-free, without pangs of conscience. How important would there be that he get there by trusting the Lord to do what he has promised to do? How awesome would it be if David was able to sit on that throne, knowing that he never deviated from God's plan, but allowed God to work it out in his way and in his timing. See, that was the downfall of Saul, wasn't it? Saul's entire life was about deviating from God's plan and doing what he wanted to do. Saul sought to take his rights by force. Saul sought to avenge himself. Saul had an entire family, Ahimelech's family, put to death because they offended him. So if David is going out of offense to kill Nabal and his household, how different is he then from Saul? He's no different. He's even, we could say, worse than Saul, because at least Saul ordered Doeg, an Edomite, to do his work. David was going there to take care of it himself. Verse 26 and 31 and 33 are pivotal verses in this narrative. Should underline at least parts of these. If David had gone through with his plan, David would have worked salvation for himself. Some translations say avenge himself, but I think the word is salvation. It's that Hebrew word yash, which is where we get the word Joshua or Yeshua from, which means salvation. And so Abigail warns him, basically, that if he goes down this road, he has worked salvation. He has not left it up to the Lord. He's worked salvation for himself. He is saving himself with his own hand. And it worked. It had a profound effect. So we've seen the incidents that led to God stepping in. We've seen the instrument, Abigail, stepping in on God's behalf, being used by God. And now we see that there is an impact. The impact that God has done in David's life because of his stepping in to save him from himself. So we go back, verse 26. Let's look real quick again, verse 26. Very end of it. The Lord has restrained you from blood guilt and from saving with your own hand. Sorry, that's more the middle of it, right? And then verse 31, we see it again. My Lord shall have no cause of grief or pangs of conscience for having shed blood without cause, for my Lord working salvation for himself. Verse 33, David's own words. Blessed be your discretion, and blessed be you who have kept me this day from blood guilt and from working salvation with my own hand. God used Abigail to get through to David. David's normal character was restored. So how does it impact him? First thing, David's character is restored. We see that contrasted with Nabal's character. If you go back to verse 17, you see that the servant who goes and tells Abigail, hey, David can't, he protected us, and Nabal railed on him. It's like, we would go to Nabal, but there's no talking to him. He will not listen. He is a fool. And he will not listen to us. But here, Abigail goes, she skips going to Nabal because she knows that he won't listen, but she goes directly to David and speaks to him, and David listens. And his character is restored. He's not like that worthless man. This man instead, David is a man after God's own heart, and he heard Abigail's words and was contrite. He was repentant. Even later, if we go into 2 Samuel, where he does those atrocious acts, where he commits adultery and he murders a man, when he is confronted by Nathan, his heart breaks. And people often ask, how is it that David could be called a man after God's own heart when he has done such horrible things? And the answer is that his heart was always soft, and his ears were always open. Open to rebuke. How about you? When someone comes to you and confronts you about maybe something that you have done wrong, or maybe you're already in the process of doing it, or maybe you're about to do it, and they come to you and they confront you, will you listen? Will your heart be broken? Will you turn from your wicked ways? Or will you make an excuse? Just ready to justify your actions. So David was so impacted, so moved by Abigail's gift of food and her gift of speech that he promised not to attack. And he sent her away in peace. That night, Nabal was living it up, had a party. It says that he partied like a king. And he got drunk. Abigail decided he's too drunk to hear the word that she needed to speak to him, so she waited until morning, and I'm sure like with a big, huge, massive hangover, she goes up to him and tells him that she saved his life yesterday. Verse 37, the end of verse 37, and his heart died within him, and he became as a stone. And about 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. And some would say that he had a stroke, and he succumbed to that stroke 10 days later. However it happened, don't know. Either way, God took care of Nabal, which leads us to that pun. Told you we'd come back to it. So go back to verse 31. And when the Lord has dealt well with my Lord, then remember your servant. Who's she talking about? Well, she's talking about both David and Nabal. There's a pun here. When the Lord has dealt well with you, don't forget about me. Well, how is he going to deal well with David? Well, he is going to avenge David. He is going to do what David would not do and should not do. He was going to avenge David by dealing well, justly, with Nabal. And she says, don't forget me when this happens. And she was not forgotten. When David received word that Nabal had died, he certainly remembered Abigail and sent for her to be his bride. So not only was David's character restored, but a couple was wed. So there's restoration of character and a wedding of a couple. She became his third wife. Sometime probably in the wilderness, he had married a woman by the name of Ahinoam. And we see that Michal was given away to somebody else by Saul. But what an impact Abigail made on David's life by being God's instrument. She kept him from murdering Nabal. She reminded him of God's promises and David's faithfulness already, not to go away from that. She enriched David by marrying him, both emotionally and mentally, but also financially, because all that was Nabal's went over to David. And she bore him his firstborn son, Amnon. What an impact. As we conclude this study, we have to admit, right, that there are times where we need to be saved from ourselves. Maybe we too have an anger problem like David that is driving us to do something that would be displeasing to the Lord. Maybe it's not anger that's driving us. Maybe it's lust. We're just waiting to get alone with our phone or with our computer or something. Maybe it's the desire for a husband or maybe for a wife, and we're going in a direction that calls on God to step in and say, stop. And He saves us from ourselves. Maybe it's despair driving us, or maybe it's the pursuit of some job or career. Maybe you've had some dream since you were a kid that you've wanted. And you've been going after that dream for years and years and years. And rather than surrendering yourself to what God wills for your life and God's plan, you're simply trying to do everything for yourself. And God's sending things in to stop you. Here's the question. Whatever is driving you, will you be like David? With open ears? A contrite heart? Will you be willing to see and to hear what God is doing? Or will you close yourself off? With David, he does this really in an obvious way, right? I mean, he literally sends somebody to say, stop! He doesn't always do it that way. Be nice if he did. This one was pretty obvious. He doesn't always do it that way. But here's the thing. Were there incidents? Could David justify what he was doing? Were there incidents that led to David's anger and to David's rashness? Yes. There absolutely were. Rather than trusting the Lord to bless him and to take care of Nabal's ingratitude, David was willing to kill him over it. But God used Abigail as a wise and beautiful instrument to stop David cold in his tracks. And David was forever impacted by her words. And beloved, God requires of us holiness. He doesn't just require for us to act holy, He actually requires us to be holy. In other words, inwardly holy. But let's not fool ourselves, right? Because we know we mess up a lot. Sin is still within every single one of us. I recently heard Harry Reeder say these words. He says, I've got sin living in me, but I don't have to live in sin. How true those words are. Because of Jesus, we have been imputed with righteousness. There's a difference between imputed with righteousness and being imparted with righteousness. We don't believe that we have been imparted with righteousness. We believe that we have been imputed with righteousness. In other words, the word imputed just simply means that we have been charged or that we have been credited with righteousness. And so, kind of a quick example of it is if you have an ox, this is kind of an Old Testament example, you have an ox and that ox gores another ox and kills that ox. Technically, it was the ox's fault, but you're going to get credited or charged with the offense because you were responsible for that ox. And therefore, you must pay the penalty for what the ox has done. So in similar but kind of almost opposite fashion, we have been imputed, we have been charged, we have been credited with Christ's righteousness. Not because we are responsible for Christ or responsible for God. In fact, there's two imputations there. Christ was imputed, he was charged with our sin. And instead we were given his righteousness. It's like the song says, I love the song, his robes for mine, a wonderful exchange. Clothed in my sin, Christ suffered 'neath God's rage. Draped in his righteousness, I'm justified. In Christ I live, for in my place he died. It isn't to say that God doesn't impart us with anything, because he does. He imparts us with his Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit brings fruit. That he works deep within us. So that not only are we declared righteous, but we are imparted then to actually live out that righteousness by the Holy Spirit. So that we can be holy, men and women, boys and girls after God's own heart. So that there are going to be times where we will sin, but like David, it is out of our character. And we need to pray that we would be able to see God stepping in those moments that we are tempted to live out of character and save us from ourselves. 1 Corinthians 10:13, hear these words well. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it. In other words, God is going to step in. Every single time, he will step in and provide a way of saving you from yourself. The question is, will we be open to see it and hear it? May we be willing to be God's instrument also toward others, so that God's impact through us may keep our brothers and sisters from sinning.